te diríamos así como con la disputa. Entonces tú saludas y vas a leer la
Hello, good evening, and thank you very, very much for coming today. It's cold evening, perhaps you would have preferred to be at home or cozy, but the reason why we are here, as you know, is for this fantastic book presentation. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our center before we start, because some of you may not know before that we were here. Basically, we are a center for the promotion of the Spanish language and Spanish culture and Hispanic culture, or cultures. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to promote new talents as much as we can. So that's why today David is with us as well. I'm going to leave the job of, I'm going to delegate to Dr. Laukamp to introduce David. But I want to tell you, please ask you, if you have your mobiles, the volume, just to turn the volume down. And if you need the toilets, there are toilets, you go out that door and you just go round and go back here. And in case of having to leave in a rush, we just go out this door and just follow us as well. Hopefully nothing will happen and it will be all right. But this event is happening thanks to, I'm going to call Luis, thanks to Luis, because Luis has already given a couple of free talks for us, very interesting free talks on the Sor Juana de la Cruz, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and as well on the Philippines, very, very interesting. And he, me and David, they both studied at Cambridge at the time when they were doing the PhDs. And he knew that David was coming and he said, what about doing this? So thanks to Luis, this is taking place. I'm ever so pleased with it. Yesterday the one in Spanish, and it was very, very well received with lots of people. So I hope you will leave today as satisfied as the people did yesterday. So thank you, Luis, thank you, David, and I leave you too.
Well, thank you so much, Elena, for your kind words. And thank you to the Cambridge Spanish Center for hosting this event and for everyone else for being here. As mentioned by Elena, David Jiménez Torres, our guest, he obtained his PhD at the University of Cambridge, and later he was lecturer in contemporary Spanish cultural studies for 3 years in the University of Manchester. After this experience, he thought it was already high time to return to Spain, so he accepted an offer by the University Camilo José Cela in Madrid, where he is currently working as a lecturer. David has authored 4 books, 2 novels, one academic book about Ramiro de Maeztu, who was a Spanish intellectual and journalist who lived in England in the early 20th century. And he has also published recently a literary essay on Pío Baroja, who's another major Spanish author of the same period. Today we're going to focus on David's second novel, which is also the first by a Spanish author to be set in Cambridge. And this is Cambridge, mitad de la noche, a novel the plot of which follows the lives of 4 PhD students from different countries and disciplines. They meet by chance one evening in a pub in Cambridge, and later over the following week we will discover that the protagonists' individual trajectories are enmeshed in some of the great questions of our time. What is the place of universities in Western societies? What is knowledge, or what is taken to be knowledge? How should we react to violence and injustice? What can art and literature, what role can art and literature play in the world today? These are some of the questions that we're going to discuss today with David in this interview. But before we start, let me welcome you, David. Thank you very much for being here. And before I start asking you questions, we were thinking that maybe it would be a good idea that you started reading an excerpt of your novel, since parts of it have already been translated into English.
Sure.
Shall we do that?
Sure. Before I start reading, thank you all, of course, enormously for being here. Thank you to the Cambridge Spanish Center for hosting us and for agreeing to to host this event. You know, I lived in this city for about 5-ish years, so as you can imagine, it's very exciting for me to be back here and to be getting a chance to discuss this novel with you. So thank you all for being a part of this. So I'm going to read. We're in the process of discussing with British publishers about the possibility of translating the work into English. So as part of that, we have translated some excerpts from the novel. So I'll just read the opening page and a half, the very beginning of the novel, which is one of the excerpts that we've translated. I can't say much for the quality of the translation, mostly because it was undertaken by myself. So you know, feel free to, if it sounds odd or something, you know, blame it on me, and hope that eventually an actual professional translator will step in. So the novel starts as follows. At exactly the same time that 4 jihadis are deciding that the London attack will take place this weekend, and at the very moment also that a group of anarchists are agreeing to smash the shop windows on Oxford Street during this Saturday's demonstration, Beth pushes open a heavy red door at the University of Cambridge. She was expecting to walk into a big office, brimming with tables and wax seals, and workers carrying folders and parcels from one side of the room to the other. Instead of this, she finds herself facing a counter that shines underneath a fluorescent white light. Behind it, a middle-aged woman looks up and smiles at her. "May I help you?" "I think so. I'm here to submit a dissertation." They take care of the paperwork quickly. Beth signs a couple of forms and hands over the 2 hardbound copies of the dissertation she's been carrying in her backpack. One moment, they are in her hands, heavy and angular. The next moment, they've disappeared behind the counter. "Right, so that's all done for you." "That's it?" "That's it." The door opens again. In come a gust of cold wind and a girl around Beth's age who looks at them and asks, "Is this the place for submitting a dissertation?" Beth swaps places with her and walks back out into the street. The day is overcast, indecisive. The clouds erase any indication as to the time of year we are in. The narrow street stretches out towards the river like a worn rope. The door closes behind her, and Beth leans against it while she digests the fact that this has just happened. That finally, after 4 years of reactions and test tubes, she has crossed this threshold. Now, though she finds herself in a street she has walked along 1,000 times, she is also in an entirely different place. An invisible yet monumental change has taken place in the architecture of the universe, or that, in any case, is what she supposes has happened.
That was beautiful, David. Thank you. And you know, while listening to the English translation, I was just wondering, what made you, the way you described the atmosphere of Cambridge made me wonder, what made you choose this place as a literary setting? Because you have studied in other universities, you know the campuses of universities in America or in Spain. Why was Cambridge precisely what drew your attention as a novelist?
Sure. I think it's true that I've studied at other universities as well, and I've worked at other universities as well, but I do think that from a sort of biographical perspective, I do think that the 5-ish years I spent here were probably the most important of my life to date, and they were very important years where I learned a lot, and a lot of things happened, and it definitely felt, when I was thinking about writing something about universities and about the sort of academia, it did seem that Cambridge was the place that came up to in my mind the most. And there's just a lot of things about this city that really stuck with me, even well after I had moved out of here. And it also seemed to me that when people asked me about Cambridge in Spain, or when people would tell me that they had spent some time here, you know, visiting as tourists for a while, it did seem that there was a lot of things that I found very interesting and exciting about the city that weren't really being reflected like my impression is that Cambridge is this incredible sort of meeting place for lots of different people from lots of different countries, lots of different walks of life. And you see this in the colleges. You'll be at a dinner and you'll be sitting, I'll be a Spanish historian and I'll be sitting across from an Australian sociologist, and I'll have a French linguist to my right, or a Nigerian biochemist to my left, and the type of conversations that generates can be very enriching, but it can also lead to a very particular type of disorientation and a very particular type of solitude, and a sense that you don't really know where you're at and what your place here is, and those were things that I really thought were worthy of trying to explore in a novel.
And I wanted to ask you as well, or I was curious to know a bit more about the writing process of this novel. I mean, you have also published extensively academic papers, academic books, and also you do journalism. How is writing literature different from writing journalistic pieces or academic papers? And how do you find time to do everything? That last question is easy. I mean, you just count on your vacation time, or you sort of accept that your vacation time you will be doing other things that you enjoy, and hopefully you enjoy writing your novel enough that will seem like a vacation even though you're working a lot of hours on it. In the case of this novel, like I sort of started having the initial ideas for the structure and the characters in my very last months here, when I already knew that I was going to be moving to Cambridge, to Manchester, to take up an academic post, and then I was sort of keeping it in my mind and writing down notes and writing like the odd scene for maybe 3 or 4 years, and then eventually I realized that I did want to write this novel, and the only way to do it was to lock myself in my mother's from Mallorca, so we have a flat there, so I went there for the sort of month and a half that I had managed to have free one summer, and that's when I wrote the majority of the final draft of the novel. And in terms of how it's different from writing academic papers, I do think that there's one thing that one needs to keep in mind if you're deciding to write literature while also being an academic, is that you need to let the reader breathe in a novel. Like, I mean, in an academic paper, you're trying to construct an argument, and what you're trying to do is make it so perfect and so convincing and so airtight that the reader will finish your paper agreeing with you, and that's the objective of a good academic, that you will be showing, okay, this is what is actually happening, and this is what you should believe, this is what I want to convince you of. Whereas a novel isn't really about that. I think, at least the way that I want to write, and the way that I understand is the writing that I aspire to, is simply creating a world and a certain set of characters that allows you to explore a certain set of issues, but allowing the reader to breathe and to make them their own. And maybe that's at the cost of them not concluding what you would want them to think, but that's okay. And in a way, I think that is a certain measure of the success of a novel, whether you find the reader who tells you that they've read it and they tell you, actually, I thought this and this and this after reading it, and you're like, that's not at all what I intended, but that's incredible that you could make it your own in that way. Mm-hmm. And can you tell us something about the title of the novel? And I wanted also to know if, like, you have any philosophy behind every title that you give to a book. Like, what do you think the role of a title should be for a novel?
To sell novels. I do think that's 90% of the idea. I mean, I'm being facetious, but I do think that the idea is primarily to try to call the reader's attention, particularly, if you're being realistic about sort of what will happen to your book, that it will be sort of shown in a table with 50 other books from authors who have devoted a similar amount of time than you to writing their own novels, and in the next table over there will be another 50 novels, and the walls of the bookstore will be lined with other very deserving works. So I do think there's, you know, something quite logical about simply trying to generate some type of interest. And in the case of this title, it's sort of a mistranslation in a way. So it's placed with the song by the Beatles, Blackbird. So this is a song, I assume most of you will be familiar with it. It sort of starts saying, blackbird singing in the dead of night, and I translated in the dead of night to mitad de la noche, which is a slight mistranslation, but I sort of took it as a little bit of a license. And it's a song that is a recurring motif throughout the novel, and it expresses this idea that the students run into, the protagonists run into once and again. If you're familiar with the song is, you know, Paul McCartney is doing who knows what in the middle of the night, and it's all very still and very quiet, and suddenly he hears a blackbird start to sing. And that's all that happens, really, but he starts projecting meaning into this thing that has just happened, that is entirely meaningless, but he wants to give it a certain significance. And that exercise of trying to find the meaning that will give you some type of pleasure or fulfillment into things that maybe don't have a meaning is something that the students, the protagonist of this novel, constantly try to do. So that was the reason to include it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I wanted to ask you as well about whether you had any models when writing this novel. I mean, as I said initially, this is the first Spanish novel set in Cambridge, but in English there are quite a few, notably Porterhouse Blue by Tom Sharp.
Mm.
Did you feel that as a foreigner, perhaps you could say something about Cambridge that was different, or that you could say things differently than all these English authors like Sharp or Penelope Fitzgerald, who has also written on Cambridge, has done? And was any of these models useful to you?
Hmm. Yeah, they were useful. I mean, so I read Porterhouse Blue, which is delightfully funny, and I also read and again enjoyed very much Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis and the David Lodge campus trilogy. That, of course, they're not so much to write about Oxford, but to write about sort of British universities in general, and they were. You know, they're all extraordinary novels, but I did sort of feel that I wanted to steer away from the very tempting cliche not cliche, but the very tempting strategy to write a novel making fun of Cambridge and just the satirizing the dons and the gowns and the rituals. I think that's very easy to do, and I think that's something that's very tempting for an author to do when we write about this. In a way, when our friends, when we go back home, when they ask us about what Cambridge is like, I do think that there is a very strong temptation to engage in this element of satire, and I think in a way the reader expects it. And that's sort of what Javier Marías does in Todas las Almas, his famous novel about Oxford. But I felt that would really be doing a disservice to Cambridge. Like I honestly think that the city is an incredible place, and while I think we all have our moments when we laugh at it. I think there's also a lot to be said and a lot to be portrayed in literature about the type of dynamics that happen here, and the type of people that you meet here, and the type of questions that you are faced with when you're here. So I did try to steer a little bit away from that.
Nevertheless, there are some components of satire in your novel. I mean, there was something that drew my attention, which was the way you portray the obsession of some British scholars with the Spanish Civil War, and as if that was the only thing you could study when you do like Spanish history. I wanted you to elaborate on that.
Sure, that was me being a bit cheeky, to be fair. And there is a sort of the Spanish character in the novel. So it's a Spaniard, a Mexican student, a British student, and an American student, and the Spanish student who studies something remarkably similar to what I studied in my PhD dissertation is constantly running into his supervisor telling him that he should actually be studying the Spanish Civil War, and it was a way to sort of poke a bit of fun into this sense of a lot of modern contemporary Spanish Hispanism that is very Civil War focused to a certain extent, even making it seem that if you're not talking about the Civil War, then what are you doing? And But it was also a way to try to, and that type of tense relationship between students and supervisors was also very interesting to me. I mean, even though Alejandro, this character, shares a lot of traits with me, like I was very fortunate that was not the relationship with my supervisor. She was extremely generous and allowed me to pretty much go wherever I wanted with my research. But it's true that I did have quite a few friends in college and stuff who did discuss about how difficult these relationships could be, and that was something that I wanted to explore.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is that it seemed to me that the action of the novel takes place shortly after or around the year 2010 or maybe a bit later, and the referendum on Brexit is looming on the horizon. So the characters talk about it briefly. Is that something that was in the back of your mind when you were writing it, and how do you think the perception? I mean, maybe I'm swerving a bit from the novel with this question, but I just wanted to ask you about Brexit and about the experience of being a foreigner in England and how that experience might have changed after the referendum.
Sure. I think so. The novel focuses a lot on knowledge and on particularly the idea of what is knowledge for and what can we do with knowledge. And I think we have this idea that knowledge is meant to help us find solutions and to, in a way, it's this Promethean ideal that knowledge will save us, and that's part of what we do at universities. And I wanted the reader to face, and the protagonist to face constantly the question of, well, what if knowledge doesn't actually help you do much? And the protagonists are constantly faced with situations where they have the knowledge of why something is happening, but they actually can't change it. They know that it will happen, but yet they can't do anything about it. And a lot of the historical references that take place throughout the novel also hinge on that. And so consciously, I knew that this novel would come out, this year, and that, if I put a mention to the Brexit referendum as being something in the horizon and being something that the characters in the novel discuss, is something that, they say, well, evidently Brexit is not going to win. It's something that, a tiny proportion of the population will vote for. And, these were conversations that we were having in 2010, 2011, when these ideas were coming around. And I wanted the reader to know how the story ends, but at the same time to be faced with the idea of, well, but we didn't know it then. And that kind of clash between what you know and what you can do with that knowledge, and the fact that when that knowledge would have been useful, you didn't have it. Those were things that I wanted to confront the reader with. As for your question of how Brexit might have changed being a Spaniard here, I mean, I left like a few months before the referendum happened, so maybe either you or some of the other people in this room might be able to answer that better than me. I know it was a huge shock to all of us who have lived here in the UK, and it's interesting how much in Spain people are now asking the question of, well, does that force us to re-examine, for those of us who lived here a long time, does that force us to re-examine the sort of emotional ties that we created with this country, which were incredibly strong, partly because of how welcoming we felt that it was, and how easily integrated we became into a lot of dynamics. And I think that's going to be an ongoing process for quite a few years.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to a slightly different topic, I know that some readers were a bit disappointed because there's not much sex in this book. They thought that being a campus novel, this is what they would encounter, sure, and they didn't. How would you defend yourself against such accusations?
I think in the kind of, as I was saying before, of trying to disappoint the reader's expectations in what a novel about Cambridge would be, and a novel about universities would be like. It does seem that a lot of times when people write about universities, it's usually two types of stories: either young students that come here and have a sort of Bildungsroman of sex and drugs, or a story of a lecturers falling in love with students, or students falling in love with lecturers, or that type of dynamic. So like John Williams Stoner, that type of story. And of course, those stories are interesting, and there's very good novels written that include those stories. But at the same time, I wanted to be honest to my experience, which is that it's not something that I've seen very much, and I did feel that there were other stories that you could tell about universities that were equally interesting, or that at least deserved literary treatment. And I think sometimes it's good to disappoint the reader. I think sometimes that can be the best way to get them involved in the novel and to participate in something that might be relatively new.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk. I want to talk briefly about each of the characters of the novel. There's one character who is doing a PhD on the American poet Hart Crane, who I read, I discovered thanks to your book, although I have to say I failed miserably trying to understand him. And I was wondering, because it's really very challenging poet, even harder than T.S. Eliot. Why did you choose such a poet, like for the novel? Was the difficulty the point? Like you wanted your character to be doing a PhD on a topic which is incredibly challenging and difficult?
Yeah, I think, I wanted to emphasize this idea of, again, what is research for and what is knowledge for, right? And I think in the humanities you often get asked the question of what is the point of what you're doing, right? What is the point of writing another dissertation on Wordsworth or on Shakespeare or on Hart Crane? And I think one of the conclusions, or not really conclusions, but one of the things that I wanted to highlight is, well, sometimes you do it because you enjoy it, and because you can find pleasure in difficulty, in certain difficult texts. And you know, Hart Crane, I read The Bridge a lot of times in preparing for this novel. It's an extremely difficult poem, but it's also incredibly beautiful. And actually, what was very surprising to me is that I could enjoy it a lot, and I could enjoy the beauty of the lines and of some of the figures that were used in the poem without actually understanding what was going on. And I really enjoyed that tension of being like, on the one hand I'm enjoying this, and on the other hand I have no idea what's going on, and how do I explain this to myself, and what do we do with this in terms of, is this something that you should try to pursue, or isn't it? And that I think is a question that remains open-ended in the novel, because I think it's a conclusion that everyone has to find on their own, whether it's worth it or not, or whether they think that they can find some use for it or not.
Mm-hmm. Another character of the novel is a Mexican scholar who's doing a PhD on the drug-related violence in his country, and he really he's doing his PhD for the betterment of his country. You know, he wants to make a difference. So I wanted you to tell us a bit more about that, really, about this idea of knowledge as being something that can make a difference in the world, regardless of whether you're studying Hart Crane or drug-related violence or biochemistry. Everything contributes.
Yeah, I think, again, one of the things that was a recurring experience for me while I was here was meeting incredibly bright young people who had incredibly ambitious and well-meaning research projects that would create good in the world, and be it some, economic policies that would that they thought would reduce drug-related violence, or new treatments for illnesses, or great politics-related research. And I think one of the processes that you saw, if you spent enough time with people who were doing this type of research, is that while they were going on, they realized more and more how difficult it was to turn ideas into policy, and policy into results, and that element of learning about the limits of knowledge was also extremely challenging, but also very interesting. And sort of what, you're a 23-year-old young man, you receive a scholarship to go study something like this in a very prestigious university, and being of that age, you think that of course you can change the world. Why wouldn't you? It's very easy. You just do your research for 3 years, you publish a couple of papers, and the world will change, right? And as you're doing that type of research, more and more you realize that actually, if it was so easy to change the world, a lot of people would have done it before you, and there's actually, it's more likely than not that your research will actually change nothing. And that was also a tension that I thought was worth exploring, and again, proposing some solutions to that challenge, and hoping that they will be of use to the reader.
in the case of the Mexican scholar, there is a point in the novel where he has a conversation with someone who's more experienced, who gives him the advice of forget about returning to Mexico, just stay here, get a good job in the city and make money. And I wanted to ask you about this, because many of these students, scholars, PhD scholars who you describe in your novel, they might not return to their countries to do what they were supposed to do in their application for the scholarship. And there's all this concern about brain drain, about the idea that all the most talented people are going to the same clusters in 10 American universities and maybe 2 universities in the UK. And that cannot be good for the world, can it? And was that something that was also a concern or in the back of your mind when you were writing the novel? Or?
Sure. I mean, I'm interested in sort of individual dilemmas and sort of how we negotiate the tensions between what we think we should do and what we want to do. And I think this element of, people, very bright young scholars who come from other countries and who come here to do research with the idea that they will go back and that they will apply this knowledge to their home countries. But when they're here, they actually realize that this is a very comfortable place to live in, and that actually you can have incredible job opportunities here that might not be so easy for you back home. In Spain, like over the past 10 years, we've had an enormous amount of migration of young scholars who couldn't find academic posts in Spanish universities and who, decided to look for them abroad. And initially, I think everybody thinks that it's just for a couple of years and then you'll come back, and it might even be good because you'll bring some skills and some knowledge back with you. But as the years progress, you find that you can make a much better living here. You have more available in terms of research and everything. And again, that creates a lot of dilemmas and a lot of tensions, and it creates some tensions with your families, with your fellow scholars, with the people that you left behind, and with yourself and with your sense of who you are. And that's, again, I don't really have the solution to what is right there. And I think it's interesting because I'm not sure that there is one right answer really to that question of whether to stay or to go. Evidently, it's not great that the great research clusters of the world are mostly concentrated in 2 countries. And it would be wonderful if that could be more distributed, but evidently that's our problem as Spaniards also, that we haven't been able to create a university system that attracts talent instead of pushing it away. So I'm not sure that there's anybody to blame in that other than ourselves.
And I like also the fact that you made the effort of including not only scholars in humanities, which was probably the easiest bit, but also scientists in your novel. One of the main characters is a scientist doing a PhD on biochemistry. And that made me think on, this lecture, The Two Cultures by C.P. Snow, which he gave in 1959. Where his thesis was basically that the intellectual life of the whole Western society is split into 2 cultures, namely humanities and sciences, and that actually is a major obstacle to solve the world's problems. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to ask you, for instance, when these characters, these scientists and humanities scholars are interacting in a novel, are they speaking 2 different languages? Are they understanding each other?
Sure. I think they are speaking 2 different languages. And, I think one of the reasons why I wanted to include characters who did very different things to what I did in my research in the novel is that, again, I think one of the incredible things about this city is that you can meet people who do such drastically different things while nominally doing the same thing, right? So I'm a PhD student and you're a PhD student, right? We might be at the same college. We might even be from the same country, etc. So nominally we would share a lot, but then, if I'm in the humanities and you're in the sciences, our daily routines are incredibly different. The type of research that we have and how we do it is incredibly differentiated. Between working in the library on your own and working as part of a laboratory, seeing your supervisor once a month or seeing them every day in the lab. Working mostly with books or working mostly with reactions, test tubes, etc. And I was really interested in what type of conversations that then generates. And I think we've maybe all been in situations here where somebody in my case, a scientist would try to explain what their research was about to me, and I was nodding and sort of, assenting and being like, tell me more, but really I was understanding nothing. And then when I would explain my thing, I would also see their eyes glaze over, and I could see that they were regretting having asked that question. And I think it's very natural because it is incredibly different, but it's also very rewarding to try to kind of puncture those walls or that those things that separate those two worlds.
Mm-hmm. There are two issues that you don't address directly in the novel, but that you could have, because they are clearly connected to things you discuss. One of them is the issue of mental health of students. Some of the characters are really experiencing, as you said earlier, solitude, melancholy, perhaps nostalgia of their homelands. And I wanted you to tell us a bit more about that. Like, was something that concerned you when writing the novel? Even though they don't go, for instance, to the counseling service, but some of them could have. They have problems that are clearly connected to that kind of,
Sure.
And my other question was, there are all these. Sorry, maybe answer this question and then I will.
Yeah, no, I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure that I have a very good answer to it. I mean, I do think that it's...
Oh, sorry, let me rephrase it. Do you think this whole issue of mental health of students, which is something that concerns universities, not only in Cambridge, but plenty of elite, especially elite institutions, do you think that the problem is that there's such a level of being here is so demanding that students who arrive here being perfectly fine, the system, as it were, breaks them? Or do you think that it's rather the problem is that these kind of elite institutions attract people who are already predisposed to develop this kind of illness?
Well, yeah, it's a chicken or the egg thing. And again, I'm not really sure that I have an answer. I mean, I know that mental health is quite rightly a concern for universities, but it's not. I feel like the problems that the students have in the novel are also. I wanted them to have agency over their own problems, and in a way that would be one of the more frustrating things for them, that they chose to put themselves in situations. In Alejandro's case, he chose to study his PhD here. In the case of Beth, she chooses to continue in her research, even though she sent 94 applications for postdoc positions, and she has not received a positive response yet at the beginning of the novel. In a way, one of the things that was interesting to me about academia is how many people are severely unhappy in it, or at least having very strong doubts about remaining in the academic world, and yet decide to continue in it for quite a long time. And why do we do this? I think that was one of the things that I was interested in, the type of agency that we have for making ourselves or putting ourselves in positions that aren't the most conducive to our happiness. That was also something that I was interested in.
And the other issue that I wanted to ask you about was, in your novel, there's there's a wealth of reflections on politics, ideology, class, a bit on gender and race as well. Some scholars, especially in America, for instance, Neil Ferguson, argued that we all live under a blanket of political correctness, especially in academia, and that this can be an obstacle to discussing some of these issues. This is not something that you don't address in your novel, perhaps because you think that we haven't reached that it's not as problematic as it is in the US, here in British or European universities. All these discussions about whether we have gone too far in terms of political correctness.
I mean, I know that it's a very attractive discourse, and I think, again, it's something that maybe somebody would expect. Maybe somebody in Spain would expect a novel about an English-speaking university would engage with. But again, I felt that I had to be honest with my experience here. And while I was here, there was no moment in which there was something that I felt I couldn't discuss, or an idea that I couldn't really express because of whatever political correctness is. And I think there's very interesting things again that you can explore about university life that don't necessarily relate to this topic.
Stories of plot about the terrorist attacks in London and how they have an impact on the lives of the protagonists. And I wanted to ask you about that because the truth is that as you make, I think it's one of the points of your novel, no political ideology or doctrine can do justice or even explain the tragedy of a victim of terrorism, the loss of that human life. It's something unspeakable. So what can literature do?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that attracts me to the novel as a genre, and like the realist novel as a genre, is the possibility of doing some justice to the extraordinary richness of an individual life and to the wealth of experiences and memories and feelings and connections that we accumulate throughout our individual lives. And kind of parallel to that, it does strike me, you can tell me later if you think I'm wrong, but I do think that we've gotten to the point with this type of terrorist attacks like the ones that happened in London Bridge, etc., where something like this happens and we look at the number of victims and we're like, oh well, 13 or 7 or 19, or it could have been worse. It's not a very high number, or we look at the number and we grieve, but we kind of move on very quickly. I got to a point a little bit before starting to write the final draft of this novel where I felt that we were kind of glossing over the fact that each one of these people was a human being, just like us. And I know that sounds banal to say, but I do think we kind of gloss over just the incredible tragedy it is that to just lose one human life and how irreparable that damage is. And I felt that in a novel I could try to reconstruct that wealth of an individual life and then to show how fragile it is as well, and how quickly that can be lost in an attack like this.
Thank you, David.